Somewhere in the tobacco fields of Pennsylvania County, Virginia, there exists a marriage ledger that no local historian will discuss. 40 names, 40 rejections, all dated between March and October of 1847. The final entry, written in a trembling hand, reads, "Only Margaret Langford transferred to quarters November 12. Yeah. What the county records will never tell you is that this wasn't a marriage ledger at all. It was a death certificate written 6 months in advance. Tonight, we uncover what really happened to Colonel Thaddeus Langford's daughter and why 3 families in Virginia still refuse to speak her name. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Langford and the darkness that consumed Langford Plantation, we need you to be part of this investigation. If stories like this buried beneath centuries of silence make your blood run cold, hit that subscribe button right now and tell us in the comments what state or city are you listening from tonight. We want to know where our community of truth seekers is watching from. Now, let's step back into 1847 to a plantation where pride would become more dangerous than any bullet. The road leading to Langford Plantation had once been the pride of Pittsea County, lined with white oaks that formed a cathedral arch stretching nearly half a mile from the main road to the house itself. But by the spring of 1847, those same trees had become a tunnel of whispers, their branches scraping against carriages like skeletal fingers, their roots buckling the red clay path until every approach to the estate felt like a warning. The house itself, a Georgian manor built in 1789, stood 3 stories tall with 12/12 windows that caught the morning light and reflected it back like vacant eyes. Locals claimed you could see those windows gleaming from the town of Chatham, 5 miles distant, especially at sunset when the glass turned the color of dried blood. Colonel Thaddeus Langford had inherited this estate from his father in 1831 along with 240 acres of prime tobacco land, a workforce of 63 enslaved people and a reputation that stretched back to the Revolutionary War when his grandfather had served under Lafayette. Thaddeus himself had added to that legacy, volunteering for service in the Mexican-American War despite being 47 years old, leading a Virginia cavalry unit through the siege of Veracruz and returning home in February of 1847 with a saber scar across his left cheek and the hollow eyes of a man who had seen too much death. What he had not returned with was money. The plantation had hemorrhaged income during his absence. Tobacco prices had collapsed and his wife Catherine had died of consumption in December of 1846, just 6 weeks before his return, leaving behind medical debts that consumed what little remained in the family coffers. But Thaddeus Langford was not a man who accepted defeat. He was 6 feet 4 inches in tall, broad-shouldered despite his age, with iron gray hair he kept militarily short and a voice that could crack like a whip across a tobacco field. His neighbors respected him. His enslaved workers feared him. And his daughter Margaret adored him with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who had never learned that love could be conditional. Margaret was 23 years old that spring, the only surviving child of 3, born in 1824 when her mother was 41, and the doctors had long since given up hope of more children. She had her mother's auburn hair and green eyes, her father's height, and a body that the polite society of Virginia in 1847 considered grotesquely inappropriate for a woman of her station. Margaret Langford weighed approximately 260 pounds. In an era when women cinched their waists to 18 in and fainted decorously from tight corsets, Margaret could not fit into fashionable dresses. The local seamstress, a sharp-tonged woman named Mrs. Violet Pute, had to specially construct Margaret's clothing using nearly double the fabric and reinforced seams, and she charged accordingly. Margaret's size was not discussed openly, but it was understood by everyone who mattered. In the drawing rooms of Pennsylvania County, among the wives of tobacco planters and Richmond merchants, Margaret Langford was referred to in careful euphemisms. She has a robust constitution. She enjoys her meals. She takes after her father's size. What they meant, what everyone understood, was that Margaret Langford was unmarriageable. This had not always been the case, or rather, it had not always been acknowledged as such. When Margaret was 17, there had been a brief period when her father's wealth and status had been enough to override whispered concerns about her appearance. A young lawyer from Lynchburg had called on her twice, bringing flowers and sitting stiffly in the Langford parlor, while Margaret poured tea with shaking hands. But the courtship had ended abruptly after the lawyer attended a party where he overheard Margaret's cousin, a vicious socialite named Penelope Saunders, describe Margaret as that enormous girl who will crush any man foolish enough to marry her. The lawyer never called again. Margaret had cried for 3 days, locked in her bedroom while her mother sat outside the door, helpless and heartbroken. The years had passed. Margaret had learned to accept her isolation, spending her days reading, walking the plantation grounds in the early morning before the workers arrived in the fields, and helping her mother with household management. She had a gentle disposition, a quick mind for numbers, and a talent for watercolor painting that her mother encouraged. In a different world, these qualities might have been enough. But this was Virginia in 1847, and Margaret Langford's world was about to collapse. The trouble began in earnest on March 3, 1847, exactly 2 weeks after Colonel Langford's return from Mexico. He had spent those first weeks closeted in his study, reviewing ledgers with his plantation overseer, a lean and weathered man named Hosea Drummond, who had managed the property during the colonel's absence. What Drummond showed him must have been devastating, though the colonel's face betrayed nothing. He simply closed the final ledger, placed both hands flat on his desk, and said in a voice like grinding stones, "How long do we have?" Drummond, who had known the colonel for 15 years, did not flinch. 6 months, he replied. Maybe 8 if we cut rations again and delay the equipment repairs. But the creditors from Richmond are already circling. They smell blood. That night, sitting alone in the library with a bottle of whiskey that had survived the war, Colonel Thaddeus Langford made a decision that would destroy his daughter's life. He would marry her off, not for love, not even for compatibility, but for cold financial calculation. Margaret's dowry would be his escape from debt, her marriage his salvation, and her feelings were simply irrelevant compared to the survival of the Langford name. The next morning, he summoned Margaret to his study and told her to prepare herself. She was going to Richmond for the social season. She was going to meet eligible men, and she was going to accept the first reasonable proposal that came her way. Margaret, who had not left the plantation for more than a day trip in 5 years, felt her stomach drop. "Father," she whispered. "I don't think the gentlemen in Richmond, they won't." But the colonel cut her off with a raised hand. "You will do this," he said flatly. "For the family, for the plantation, for your mother's memory." What happened next would be documented in Margaret's own diary, discovered in 1923 in a sealed trunk in the attic of a farmhouse outside Chatham, purchased by a family who had no connection to the Langfords, but who found the journal hidden beneath 3 layers of rotting fabric and brought it to the local historical society. The society catalogued it, read it once, and quietly filed it away in their restricted archives, where it remains today, accessible only to researchers with written permission from the board. That diary, written in Margaret's precise, educated hand, describes what she called the Parade of Suitors, and it makes for some of the most heartbreaking reading in Virginia's historical record. The colonel's plan was simple and brutal. He used his military connections, his family name, and every remaining favor he could call in to arrange introductions with eligible men across Virginia and neighboring states. He cast a wide net. Widowers looking for a competent household manager, younger sons of good families who needed money more than beauty, merchants seeking connections to the plantation aristocracy, even a few fortune seekers from as far away as Baltimore, who had heard rumors of the Langford estate and assumed there was still wealth to be extracted. The colonel told each of them the same carefully crafted story. His daughter was educated, well-bred, accomplished in household management, and would bring a significant dowry. He did not mention her appearance. He did not mention that the dowry he promised was mostly fictional, built on the assumption that he could mortgage the remaining value of the plantation. He did not mention that he was in essence selling his daughter to the highest bidder who would accept her. The first suitor arrived on March 8, 1847. His name was Gerald Pritchard, a tobacco merchant from Petersburg in his early 50s. Already twice widowed and looking for a wife who could manage his household and bear him an heir. He arrived in a rented carriage, dressed in a frock coat that had been fashionable 10 years prior, and he sat in the Langford parlor making small talk about weather and tobacco yields while Margaret served tea. She had dressed carefully that morning, wearing her newest dress, a deep blue silk that Mrs. Pute had spent 2 weeks constructing, and she had arranged her hair in elaborate curls that took her maid nearly an hour to perfect. But when Pritchard first saw her, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise that he quickly masked with professional courtesy. The visit lasted 40 minutes. Pritchard complimented the tea, discussed a potential business arrangement with the colonel, and left with vague promises to consider the matter carefully. He sent his rejection letter 3 days later. It was addressed to the colonel, not to Margaret, and it made no mention of her personally. Instead, it focused on unforeseen complications in my business affairs and a reconsideration of my readiness for matrimony at this time. Margaret never saw the letter, but she saw her father's face when he read it. The way his jaw tightened and his knuckles went white as he crumpled the paper and threw it into the fireplace. "There will be others," he said, not looking at her. "Better men, more suitable." But there were not better men. There was Edward Calenderer, a lawyer from Richmond, who barely concealed his shock when he met Margaret, who cut his visit short after 20 minutes with a transparent excuse about urgent legal matters. There was Thomas Wayne, a widower with 6 children who needed a mother for them, who sat stiffly through dinner and left before dessert was served, claiming sudden illness. There was Benjamin Cross, a merchant from Norfolk who arrived drunk, made a series of inappropriate jokes, and had to be escorted off the property by Hosea Drummond. Each rejection was documented in Margaret's diary, not with anger or bitterness, but with a growing sense of hopeless resignation. "Mr. Wainwright seemed kind," she wrote after the 4th rejection. "Perhaps it is for the best. His children deserve someone who can chase them through the garden, and I know I cannot." By the end of April, 12 men had been introduced to Margaret Langford. 12 men had rejected her. The Colonel's desperation was becoming visible to everyone on the plantation. He stopped shaving regularly. His clothes became rumpled, and he spent long hours in his study drinking whiskey and staring at his father's portrait above the fireplace. The enslaved workers who saw everything that happened in the main house began to whisper among themselves. Something was wrong with the Colonel. Something was breaking inside him. And when a man like Thaddeus Langford broke, everyone around him would suffer. The pattern continued through May and June. More introductions, more carefully orchestrated visits, more rejections. Some of the men were cruel about it, like Harrison Cobb from Lynchburg, who told the Colonel directly that he could not be seen in public with a woman of such excessive proportions. Others were more circumspect, like William Fenton from Charlottesville, who praised Margaret's intelligence and kindness before explaining that he had formed an attachment elsewhere. By July, the count had reached 23 rejections, and Margaret had stopped writing in her diary altogether. The last entry dated July 4, 1847 read simply, "I am so tired. I wish Mother were here. I wish I could disappear." What Margaret did not know, what she could not have known, was that the rejections were not entirely organic. Someone was sabotaging her chances, and they were doing it with surgical precision. That someone was Jackson Ruthven, a wealthy tobacco factor from Richmond, who had been the Colonel's primary business rival for nearly a decade. Ruthven owned processing facilities that competed directly with Langford's crops, and he had been quietly buying up the Colonel's debts from smaller creditors, consolidating them, and preparing to call them all due at once. But Ruthven was not content with mere financial destruction. He wanted to humiliate Thaddeus Langford completely, and he had discovered the perfect weapon, Margaret herself. Ruthven had agents throughout Virginia, men who owed him favors or money, and he used them to spread carefully calibrated rumors about Margaret Langford. Not lies exactly, but exaggerations and cruel truths whispered in the right ears at the right times. He made sure that every potential suitor heard about Margaret's size before they arrived at the plantation. He ensured that men who might have been genuinely interested in her dowry or family connections received alternative better offers just before their scheduled visits to Langford Plantation. He even went so far as to hire an actor to pose as a suitor, visit Margaret, treat her with exaggerated disgust, and then spread stories about the visit through Richmond society. By August, Margaret Langford had become a joke in certain circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of indulgence, and the Colonel's increasingly frantic attempts to find her a husband had become entertainment for people who had nothing better to do than mock the fallen mighty. The 40th and final rejection came on October 17, 1847. His name was Stuart Pembroke, and he was not a gentleman at all, but a confidence man from Baltimore, who had heard about the Colonel's desperation, and decided to extract what he could before disappearing. Pembroke was handsome, well-dressed, and utterly without conscience. He arrived at Langford Plantation with forged letters of introduction, a fabricated family history, and a plan to convince the Colonel to advance him several thousand as a wedding preparation fund before vanishing. But when Pembroke saw Margaret, even his professional composure faltered. "My God," he muttered, just loud enough for Margaret to hear. "They didn't tell me it was this bad." Margaret ran from the room. She locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out, even when her father pounded on the door and demanded she return to entertain their guest. Pembroke, sensing that his scheme had collapsed, made his excuses and left within the hour, taking with him a silver tea service he had pocketed from the parlor. The Colonel, standing in the empty drawing room, felt something inside him snap. All the war trauma, all the financial pressure, all the humiliation of watching his daughter rejected again and again, it coalesced into a single terrible rage. And in that rage, Thaddeus Langford made a decision that would condemn his daughter to a fate worse than any rejection. That night, alone in his study, the colonel began drafting letters, not to potential suitors, but to lawyers in Richmond. He had remembered something, a clause in his late wife Catherine's will, something that he had not thought about in the chaos following her death. Catherine's family, the Prescotts, were old money from the Tidewater region. And when she married Thaddeus in 1820, she had brought a substantial dowry that was placed in a trust to be released to the colonel upon Catherine's death with one condition, that any surviving children be established in appropriate circumstances. The lawyers who drafted the will had been deliberately vague about what appropriate circumstances meant, but the intent was clear. Catherine's family had not entirely trusted Thaddeus, and they wanted to ensure that if they had children, those children would be provided for. Catherine had died 6 months earlier, and the trust had not yet been settled because the lawyers were still reviewing the estate. The total value was approximately $30,000, an enormous sum in 1847, enough to pay off all the colonel's debts and restore the plantation to solvency. But there was a problem. Margaret was still unmarried and still living at home, which the Prescott family lawyers might argue did not constitute appropriate circumstances. The colonel needed Margaret to be officially established elsewhere, away from the plantation, in a situation that the lawyers would accept as fulfilling the terms of the trust. And as he sat in his study, drinking whiskey and staring at the ledgers that documented his financial ruin, a terrible idea began to form. What if Margaret disappeared? Not literally, of course, that would raise too many questions. But what if she was officially transferred somewhere else, removed from the household, placed in a situation that could be documented but not easily investigated? The colonel's mind, twisted by desperation and alcohol, began constructing a plan. The enslaved quarters on the plantation, a collection of rough cabins about 4 miles from the main house, were technically separate from the main estate. What if Margaret was transferred there, officially recorded as having been sent to assist with household management of the quarters, or some similar administrative fiction? To the lawyers in Richmond, it would look like she had been given a position of responsibility established in her own residence. They would never visit to verify. And if they did, he could construct some elaborate excuse. And once the trust was settled and the money released, well, arrangements could be made. Margaret could have an accident. Tragic. But these things happened on plantations. People fell ill. Injuries occurred. Who would question it? The plan was monstrous. But in the colonel's fractured logic, it was also necessary. His family name, his legacy, the plantation itself, all of it hung in the balance. Margaret was already ruined in society's eyes, unmarriageable and useless to him except as an obstacle to the inheritance. If she had to suffer for a few months in the quarters, so be it. She was his daughter, his property in every practical sense, and he would use her as he saw fit. On October 23, 1847, 6 days after Stuart Pembroke's visit, Colonel Thaddeus Langford summoned his overseer, Hosea Drummond, and his house staff, and informed them that Margaret would be moving to the quarters immediately. There was no discussion. There were no explanations beyond the vague statement that Margaret needs to understand her situation. What happened next would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Margaret, still locked in her room, refusing meals and sinking into despair, was told by her maid, a young enslaved woman named Celia, that the colonel wanted to speak with her. Margaret, thinking perhaps her father wanted to apologize for the humiliation of the Pembroke visit, cleaned her face, straightened her dress, and went downstairs. The colonel was waiting in the front hall with Drummond and 2 of the plantation's field hands, strong men who worked tobacco and did not typically come to the main house. "Margaret," the colonel said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You are being reassigned. You will be living in the quarters from now on. Your belongings will be brought to you." Margaret stared at him uncomprehending. "The quarters?" she whispered. "Father, I don't understand." "What do you mean?" The colonel did not meet her eyes. "You heard me. You will assist with management there. It will be good for you to understand how this plantation actually functions. Now go." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Father, please, I don't." "You can't. I'm your daughter." The colonel's face hardened. "You are a burden," he said, and each word fell like a stone. "You have failed in every duty I set before you. 40 men, Margaret. 40 men looked at you and decided they would rather remain alone than marry you. You are worthless to me as a daughter, so you will be useful as labor. Now go. The two field hands stepped forward, not touching her, but making it clear they would if necessary. Margaret looked at Drummond, at Celia, at the other house staff who had gathered in the hallway, their faces carefully blank. No one met her eyes. No one spoke. And Margaret, who had never been hit in her life, who had been raised with every privilege that wealth and status could provide, realized with absolute horror that her father was serious. She was being thrown out of her own home and forced into the slave quarters like cattle. "Father," she tried one more time, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I'll do anything. I'll try harder to find her husband." But the colonel had already turned away, walking back toward his study, dismissing her as he might dismiss a servant. "Take her," he said over his shoulder to the field hands. "Make sure she understands this is not negotiable." They did not drag her. They did not have to. Margaret, shaking with shock and terror, walked out of the main house of her own volition, down the front steps where carriages had brought 40 suitors to reject her, down the oak line drive that now seemed to stretch forever, and toward the quarter-mile path that led to the enslaved quarters. Behind her, Celia gathered up an armful of Margaret's clothing, tears streaming down her face, forbidden by Drummond from saying a word. The other servants watched from the windows as Margaret disappeared down the path, her blue silk dress dragging in the red clay, her footsteps unsteady. And in his study, Colonel Thaddeus Langford poured himself another whiskey, and began drafting the letter to his late wife's lawyers, informing them that his daughter had been successfully established in an independent position, and requesting the immediate release of the trust funds. The quarters at Langford Plantation were typical of their kind in Virginia in 1847. A collection of 12 small cabins arranged in 2 rows facing each other with a communal well at the center and a larger building at the far end that served as a cooking and gathering space. Each cabin was approximately 16 foot x 14 feet, constructed of rough-hewn logs with clay chinking, a single door and 1 window, a dirt floor, and a fireplace that provided both heat and cooking space. Most cabins housed between 6 and 8 people, families, or groups of unrelated individuals thrown together by the plantation's labor needs. The furniture was minimal. Rough beds made of wood planks covered with straw mattresses, a few stools or benches, sometimes a table if the occupants had been able to construct one from scrap wood. There was no privacy, no comfort, and very little personal space. Margaret arrived at the quarters just as the workday was ending, when the field hands were returning from the tobacco fields and the domestic workers were finishing their tasks at the main house. The sight of the colonel's daughter walking toward them, escorted by 2 of their own, brought work to a halt. People stopped mid-motion, hose dropping to the ground, conversations dying mid-sentence. Everyone knew who Margaret was, even those who never worked in the main house. They had seen her walking the grounds in the early mornings, had caught glimpses of her through the windows, had heard the house staff talk about her, and now here she was walking into their world as if she belonged there, and no one knew what it meant. Hosea Drummond, who had followed at a distance, pushed forward and pointed to one of the smaller cabins at the end of the second row. "That one," he said to the field hands, "put her in there." The cabin he indicated was occupied by an elderly woman named Suddy, who had been on the plantation since before the colonel was born, and 2 younger women, Ruth and Patience, who worked in the laundry. Drummond turned to address the assembled workers, his voice carrying across the space. "Colonel's orders. Miss Margaret will be living here now. You treat her respectful. You don't bother her, and you don't ask questions. Anyone who causes trouble answers to me. Understood?" There was a chorus of quiet yes sirs, and Drummond nodded once sharply before turning and walking back toward the main house, taking the 2 field hands with him, and leaving Margaret standing alone in the center of the quarters, surrounded by 63 enslaved people who had no idea what to do with her. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Suddy, who had survived too much in her 70-some years to be intimidated by awkwardness, stepped forward from the cabin. She was small and bent, her hair completely gray beneath the cloth wrapped around her head, her hands lead from decades of labor. She looked Margaret up and down with sharp assessing eyes, taking in the expensive dress, the carefully arranged hair that was now falling loose, the red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. "Come on then," Sadie said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her age. "Standing there gawking won't make it easier." Inside, Margaret followed her into the cabin, ducking through the low doorway, and the smell hit her immediately. Woodham smoke, sweat, mildew, and something indefinable that was simply the smell of poverty and confinement. The interior was so dark after the afternoon sunlight that Margaret had to pause while her eyes adjusted. When they did, she saw Ruth and Patience standing by the fireplace, both young women in their 20s, watching her with expressions that were carefully neutral. Suddy gestured to a corner where there was a small space barely 4 foot square between one of the bed platforms and the wall. "That's yours," she said. "We'll get you some straw for bedding. Ruth, go fetch some from the barn." Ruth left without a word, and Patience stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Margaret's dress. "You're going to need different clothes," she said quietly. "That won't last a day here." Margaret looked down at her blue silk dress, the one that had cost the equivalent of 3 months' wages for a skilled laborer, and realized how ridiculous she must look. "I don't have anything else," she whispered. "They took everything. My father," her voice broke and Patience's expression softened slightly. "We'll find you something," she said. "But you need to understand, Miss Margaret, if that's even what we call you now. This isn't a game. This is our lives. And if you're here, really here, you follow the same rules we do." That first night, Margaret did not sleep. She lay on the straw mattress that Ruth had brought, covered with a thin blanket that smelled of smoke, listening to the sounds of the cabin around her. Sada's snoring, rough and rhythmic. Ruth and Patience whispering to each other in voices too low to make out words. Outside, the sounds of the quarters settling for the night. Children crying, someone coughing, a dog barking in the distance. Margaret had never been cold in her life. Not really, but the cabin had no real insulation, and the November night air crept through every crack in the walls. She pulled the blanket tighter and felt tears sliding down her face, silent and hot. This could not be real. This could not be her life. Surely tomorrow her father would come to his senses, would send for her, would apologize for this terrible punishment. But deep down, in a place she did not want to examine, Margaret knew the truth. This was not temporary. This was not a lesson. This was abandonment. The next morning, Margaret was woken before dawn by Suddy shaking her shoulder. "Get up," the old woman said, not unkindly. "Work bell rings in 20 minutes. You don't want to be late." Margaret sat up, disoriented and aching from sleeping on the straw, and realized that Ruth and Patience were already gone. "Work, bell," she repeated stupidly. Suddy nodded. "We're on laundry duty, all of us in this cabin. That means you, too, now. Come on, wash your face at the well and put on these." She held out a bundle of clothing, a rough cotton dress, gray from wear and washing, a pair of battered shoes, and a kerchief. Margaret took them with numb fingers, staring at the coarse fabric. I've never done laundry," she said, and the words sounded pathetic even to her own ears. Sada's expression did not change. "You'll learn," she said simply. "Or you'll fail. Either way, the work gets done." Margaret learned. She learned that laundry at Lanford Plantation meant hauling water from the well, heating it in massive iron kettles over open fires, scrubbing linens and clothing against washboards until her hands were raw and bleeding, and then hanging everything to dry on lines stretched between trees. She learned that the work never stopped, that there were always more sheets, more shirts, more household linens that needed cleaning, and that the house staff brought down baskets 3 times a day. Relentless and expectant, she learned that her body, which she had always thought of as too large, too heavy, too much, was actually not strong enough for this kind of labor. By the end of the first day, her back was screaming. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire, and she had blisters on both hands. By the end of the first week, she could barely stand. But something else was happening, too. Something Margaret had not expected. The other women were watching her, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of weary curiosity, as if she were an exotic animal that had wandered into their space and might be dangerous or might be harmless. Ruth was the first to speak to her directly on the 3rd day when Margaret collapsed beside one of the wash kettles, sobbing from exhaustion and pain. Ruth had knelt beside her, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and said quietly, "If you stop crying and keep working, I'll show you an easier way to wring out the sheets, but you have to pull yourself together. Drummond sees you like this, he'll beat you. Don't matter whose daughter you are." That was when Margaret understood. Whatever protection her father's name had once provided, it was gone. Now here in the quarters, she was subject to the same rules, the same punishments, the same brutal reality that the enslaved workers had lived with their entire lives. If she failed to work, she would be punished. If she complained, she would be punished. If she tried to use her former status to demand special treatment, she would be worse than punished. She would be rejected by the only community she had left. So Margaret dried her tears, nodded to Ruth, and learned how to wring out sheets the way Ruth showed her, using her body weight and twisting motions instead of pure arm strength. It was still agonizing work, but it was survivable. As the weeks passed and Margaret's transformation from plantation daughter to quarters worker became complete, something darker was unfolding behind the closed doors of the main house. If this story is gripping you, hit that like button right now and leave a comment with your theories about what the Colonel was really planning. Do you think Margaret will ever discover the truth? And before we reveal what happened next, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest secrets. Now, let's return to November of 1847, where Margaret was about to stumble upon the first clue that her father's cruelty had a very specific purpose. By the middle of November, Margaret had been in the quarters for 4 weeks, and she was beginning to understand the rhythm of life there, the unspoken rules and hierarchies that governed everything. Sudie was the unofficial leader of their cabin. Her age and experience giving her authority that even Hosea Drummond respected. Ruth was pragmatic and efficient, focused on survival above all else. Patience was the quietest of the three, but she had a sharp mind and noticed details that others missed. And Margaret slowly and painfully was learning her place among them. Not as the Colonel's daughter, but as another worker, another body contributing to the endless cycle of plantation labor. But there was one thing Margaret could not let go of. The question of why. Why had her father done this? She knew he was angry about the failed courtships, knew he was under financial pressure, but this punishment seemed so extreme, so unnecessary. Surely, he could have sent her to live with relatives or placed her in some kind of domestic service position that would have been degrading, but not this brutal. Why the quarters specifically? Why the complete erasure of her former life? The questions nared at her, especially at night when she lay on her straw mattress, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the senseless. The answer began to reveal itself on November 19, 1847, when Celia, Margaret's former maid, came down to the quarters on an errand from the main house. Celia had been Margaret's maid since Margaret was 16, had helped her dress for those 40 humiliating courtship visits, had held her while she cried after each rejection. When Celia saw Margaret at the laundry kettles, her face went pale. She sat down the basket she was carrying, looked around to ensure no one from the main house was watching, and approached Margaret at the well where she was drawing water. "Miss Margaret," Celia whispered, her voice urgent. "I have to tell you something." "I'm not supposed to," Drummond said. "We'll be whipped if we talk to you, but you need to know." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Celia glanced around again, then spoke quickly. "Your father's been writing letters to lawyers in Richmond. I've been bringing them to the post office for him. They're about your mother's inheritance, the trust from her family. I heard him talking to Drummond about it last week. He said something about you being established elsewhere and the money being released. Miss Margaret, I think he put you here so he could tell the lawyers you've been given a position away from the main house. I think he's lying to them about where you are." Margaret felt the world tilt. "He's stealing my mother's inheritance," she said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "That trust was supposed to provide for me for any children. But if he can convince the lawyers I've been taken care of, he gets the money." Celia nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I think there's more," she whispered. "I heard him tell Drummond that once the money comes through, there will be one more arrangement to make. Miss Margaret, I'm afraid for you. I think he's planning something worse." Before Margaret could respond, they heard footsteps approaching, and Celia quickly grabbed her basket and hurried away, leaving Margaret standing at the well with a terrible understanding crystallizing in her mind. Her father had not just abandoned her. He had strategically positioned her to steal her inheritance, and once he had the money, she would become a liability, a loose end that needed to be eliminated. That night, Margaret told Sudie everything. She had no choice. If her father was planning to harm her, she needed allies, and the only people who might help her were the women in this cabin, who had nothing to gain from her father's schemes. Sudie listened in silence, her weathered face unreadable in the firelight, while Ruth and Patience sat nearby, pretending not to listen, but hearing every word. When Margaret finished, Suddy was quiet for a long moment, then said something that changed everything. "Your father's not the first master to try to make someone disappear. But here's what he doesn't understand. Down here in the quarters, we see everything. We know everything, and we remember." She leaned forward, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "If you want to survive this girl, you're going to have to stop thinking like his daughter and start thinking like us. You're going to have to become invisible, useful, and patient, and when the time comes, you're going to have to fight." Over the following weeks, Margaret became part of a conspiracy she had never imagined existed. The enslaved community at Lanford Plantation had networks of information that rivaled anything in Richmond society. They knew which overseers could be bribed, which merchants in town were sympathetic, which free black families might offer shelter, and most importantly, they knew how to communicate without being detected. Patience, it turned out, could read and write, taught secretly by a previous owner's daughter before being sold to Langford. Ruth had a brother who worked on a neighboring plantation and brought news every Sunday when the workers had their half-day of rest. And Suddy, who had lived through more than 7 decades of slavery, had connections that stretched across 3 counties. They began gathering evidence. Celia, risking brutal punishment, started copying passages from the colonel's letters before they were sent, using paper scraps and hiding them in laundry baskets that came down to the quarters. Margaret, using the education her mother had given her, helped decode the legal language and piece together exactly what her father was doing. The trust from her mother's family was worth $32,000, and the colonel had convinced the lawyers that Margaret had been appropriately established in a household management position on a neighboring estate, a complete fabrication that he supported with forged letters supposedly from Margaret herself, describing her satisfaction with her new situation. But the most chilling discovery came in early December when Celia brought down a scrap of paper she had found in the colonel's study. Partially burned in the fireplace, but still readable. It was a draft of a letter to Dr. Samuel Hewitt, the county physician, discussing arrangements for examining a body after an unfortunate accident involving a fall. The letter was dated January 15, 1848, 2 months in the future, and it referenced the colonel's daughter without using Margaret's name. The implication was horrific and clear. Her father was planning her death, had already chosen the date, and was preparing the official story in advance. Margaret, reading those words by candlelight in the cabin, felt ice spread through her veins. She had less than 2 months to save her own life. The winter of 1847 settled over Pennsylvania County with unusual severity, bringing early snows and temperatures that made work in the quarters almost unbearable. Margaret's hands, once soft and carefully maintained, became rough and scarred from the constant exposure to lye soap and freezing water. Her body, which had been the source of so much shame and rejection, was transforming through labor, becoming leaner and stronger, though she barely noticed the change. Her mind was focused entirely on survival, on the deadly timeline her father had set, and on the plan that Suddy and the others were carefully constructing. The plan was audacious and dangerous. They would use the colonel's own scheme against him. If he wanted Margaret to disappear, then she would disappear, but not in the way he intended. On January 14, 1848, the night before the planned accident, Margaret would vanish from the quarters. The enslaved community would help her escape north using connections to the Underground Railroad that Suddy had carefully maintained for years. But here was the genius of the plan. They would not just help Margaret escape. They would also ensure that evidence of the colonel's plot was delivered to the Prescott family lawyers in Richmond along with testimony from witnesses who could verify what had really happened to Margaret. The colonel would lose the inheritance, face potential criminal charges, and be exposed as the monster he had become. But there was a problem. The Underground Railroad routes from Virginia were among the most dangerous in the South, heavily patrolled and brutally enforced. Margaret would need to travel nearly 200 mi through hostile territory to reach safety in Pennsylvania. And she would need to do it in the dead of winter with slave catchers and bounty hunters searching for runaways. Worse, as a white woman traveling with escaped slaves, she would be immediately noticeable and suspicious. They needed a cover story, documents, and most importantly, they needed money for bribes and emergencies. That money would have to come from the plantation itself, stolen carefully over weeks without alerting Drummond or the colonel. Ruth's skill at picking locks, learned from a previous owner who had been a locksmith, became crucial. She began systematically stealing small amounts from the main house, never enough to be noticed immediately. A few coins from the colonel's desk, a small silver spoon from the dining room, a pair of cufflinks that had belonged to Margaret's grandfather. Each item was carefully hidden in the quarters, wrapped in cloth and buried beneath the floorboards of Sada's cabin. By Christmas, they had accumulated nearly $40 in cash and goods, enough to sustain Margaret's journey if everything went perfectly. But they all knew that nothing ever went perfectly when it came to escape. December brought another complication. Hosea Drummond, who had been the colonel's overseer for 15 years, was beginning to suspect something. He had noticed that Margaret was adapting too well to life in the quarters, that she seemed less broken and desperate than he had expected. He had also noticed small irregularities in the household accounts, missing items that should have been present. Drummond was not a stupid man, and he understood that enslaved people were always watching for opportunities to resist or escape. He increased his patrols of the quarters, started conducting random searches of the cabins, and implemented a new rule. No one was allowed to leave the quarters after dark without explicit permission enforced by guard dogs that he borrowed from a neighboring plantation. The dogs changed everything. Margaret could not simply walk away in the night. Any escape would trigger an immediate pursuit, and the dogs would track her within hours. Sudie, Ruth, and Patience held an emergency meeting in the cabin on the night of December 28th, speaking in whispers while the wind howled outside and snow piled against the walls. "We need a diversion," Sudie said finally. "Something big enough to draw everyone's attention away from the quarters for several hours. Something that gives Margaret a head start before anyone realizes she's gone." Ruth understood immediately. "Fire," she said quietly. "We burn something that matters enough to create chaos but doesn't kill anyone. The tobacco barn maybe, or the equipment shed." Patience shook her head. "Too risky. If anyone dies, they'll hang everyone in the quarters. We need something that looks like an accident but gives us time." Margaret, who had been listening with growing dread, finally spoke up. "The main house," she said, and all three women turned to look at her. "Not to burn it down completely, but to create enough smoke and panic that everyone will be focused there. I know that house better than anyone. I know where my father keeps his papers, his money, all the evidence we need to prove what he's done. If we can get in there during the confusion, we can take everything we need and leave him with nothing." Sudie studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've changed," she said, not unkindly. 2 months ago, you never would have suggested betraying your father like this." Margaret's face hardened. 2 months ago, I still thought he was my father. Now I know he's just a man trying to kill me for money." The plan crystallized over the next 2 weeks. On the night of January 13, 1848, they would create a controlled fire in the main house's kitchen chimney. A common enough accident that would create smoke and panic without necessarily destroying the entire structure. In the chaos, while the household staff and field hands were mobilized to fight the fire, Margaret would slip into the colonel's study and take the documents they needed. The letters to the lawyers, the trust documents, the draft letter about the accident, and whatever cash was in his safe. Then she would return to the quarters, gather the money and goods they had stolen, and begin her journey north, guided by contacts Sudie had secretly arranged. But as January arrived, bringing with it brutal cold and ice that made the roads nearly impossible, the tension in the quarters became almost unbearable. Everyone knew something was planned, though only a handful knew the details. The children sensed their parents' nervousness and became quiet and watchful. The men who worked the fields exchanged glances when Drummond's back was turned. And in the main house, Colonel Thaddeus Langford was making his own preparations, sharpening the timeline of his daughter's planned demise with a precision that suggested he had done this kind of thing before. On January 9th, 4 days before the planned escape, Celia brought devastating news. The colonel had moved up his schedule. Margaret's accident was now planned for January 12th, not January 15th. He had written to Dr. Witt asking him to be available on the 12th to examine a body, citing concerns about an enslaved worker who had become dangerously unstable. The implication was clear. He was going to claim that Margaret had attacked someone, that she had gone mad from her time in the quarters, and that she had been killed in self-defense. The story was perfect from his perspective, explaining away any questions about her mental state or appearance, and giving him legal cover for her death. They had 3 days. 3 days to finalize the plan, gather their courage, and execute an escape that would either save Margaret's life or get everyone involved killed. The weight of it pressed on all of them, but especially on Margaret, who understood that she was asking these women to risk everything for her, a white woman who had lived in privilege while they suffered in bondage. "Why are you helping me?" she asked Suddy on the night of January 10th as they sat by the dying fire in the cabin. "You owe me nothing. If this fails, you'll all be punished. Why take the risk?" Suddy was quiet for a long time, staring into the embers. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "You think this is just about you," she said. "But it's not. Your father represents every master who thinks he owns not just our bodies but our humanity. Every man who believes he can destroy lives without consequence because he has power and money and the law on his side. When we help you escape, when we expose what he's done, we're not just saving you. We're proving that even here, even in this hell, we have the power to resist. We have the power to win." She turned to look at Margaret, her old eyes reflecting the firelight. "Besides," she added with the ghost of a smile, "watching that men lose everything is going to be worth whatever happens to us afterward. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror at Langford Plantation intensifies." If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next on the deadly night of January 12, 1848. The night of January 12, 1848 began with a cold so intense that water in the quarters well froze solid. Margaret woke before dawn, her heart pounding, knowing that somewhere in the main house, her father was waking up with the intention of killing her before the day ended. The plan was simple in theory. At 8 o'clock that evening, Ruth would start the chimney fire. In the chaos, Margaret would enter the main house through the servants' entrance, access her father's study, and steal the documents. She would have perhaps 30 minutes before the fire was controlled and people started asking questions. The day dragged with agonizing slowness. Margaret went through her laundry duties mechanically, her hands moving while her mind rehearsed every step of the plan. Suddy had given her a small leather satchel stolen from the main house months ago where she would carry the documents. Patience had prepared a bundle of men's clothing, rough and practical, that Margaret would change into once she left the plantation. And Ruth had drawn her a map showing the route to the first safe house, a free black family's farm 10 miles north who were part of the Underground Railroad network. At 7:30 that evening, as full darkness settled over the plantation, Margaret said goodbye to the women who had saved her life. There were no dramatic speeches, no tears. Suddy simply squeezed her hand and said, "Remember what we taught you. Stay quiet, move fast, and trust no one except the people whose names I gave you." Ruth handed her the satchel and the clothing bundle. Patience gave her a small knife, barely longer than her palm, but wickedly sharp. "Just in case," she said quietly. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and slipped out of the cabin into the freezing night. At exactly 8 o'clock, as Margaret crouched in the shadows behind the main house, she saw smoke begin to pour from the kitchen chimney, thick and black and unmistakable. Within minutes, someone in the house was shouting, and the alarm bell that usually summoned workers to emergency tasks began clanging frantically. Margaret watched as people poured out of the main house. Servants, Drummond, the colonel himself in his nightshirt, all of them running toward the kitchen wing with buckets and blankets. She waited 30 seconds more, counting in her head, then slipped through the servants' entrance and moved quickly through the dark corridors toward her father's study. The study door was locked, but Ruth had taught her the basics of lockpicking, and Margaret's educated fingers were dexterous enough to manage the simple mechanism. The door clicked open and she was inside, closing it softly behind her. The room was lit only by moonlight through the windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. Margaret went directly to the desk where her father kept his current correspondence in a wooden box. She dumped the entire contents into her satchel without reading them. Then she moved to the bookshelf where she knew he kept the family safe hidden behind a false panel. Getting the safe open was harder. She did not know the combination, and there was no time to try to figure it out. In desperation, she grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the desk and smashed it against the safe's lock once, twice, 3 times. The sound was horrifyingly loud, but outside, the chaos of the fire was creating enough noise to mask it. On the 4th strike, the lock mechanism broke and the safe door swung open. Inside was exactly what she needed. Bundles of cash, her mother's jewelry, the official trust documents, and most damningly, a journal where her father had documented his entire plan in meticulous detail, including the date of her planned death and the name of the accomplice he had hired to make it look like an accident. Margaret was stuffing everything into the satchel when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy footsteps, moving fast. She froze, her hand on the knife Patience had given her, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped outside the study door. There was a pause and then the door handle began to turn. Margaret pressed herself against the wall behind the door. The knife raised, every muscle tensed. The door opened and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the corridor lamplight. It was Hosea Drummond. He stood in the doorway looking at the ransacked desk and the broken safe, and then his eyes adjusted to the darkness and found Margaret pressed against the wall with the knife in her hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Drummond said very quietly, "I wondered if you'd have the spine to do it." Margaret did not lower the knife. "Don't try to stop me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know what my father's planning. I have proof and I'm leaving tonight." Drummond looked at her for another long moment, then did something Margaret never expected. He stepped aside from the doorway and gestured toward the corridor. "Then you'd better hurry," he said. "The fire's almost out, and when the colonel realizes you're gone, he'll send the dogs after you within the hour." Margaret stared at him, confused and suspicious. "Why are you helping me?" Drummond's expression was unreadable. "Because I've worked for your father for 15 years, he said quietly. "And I'm tired of burying the people he decides are inconvenient. There's a grave in the woods behind the quarters, unmarked, where he made me bury a slave woman who threatened to report him to the authorities for something he did. That was 10 years ago, and I've lived with that ever since. I won't help him do it again." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a pass signed by the colonel. It says you're traveling on plantation business. It won't hold up to serious scrutiny, but it might get you past casual patrols. Now go before I change my mind." Margaret ran. She ran through the corridors of the house where she had spent her entire life, past the parlor where 40 men had rejected her, past the dining room where she had eaten 1,000 meals, past her old bedroom where she had cried herself to sleep. After each humiliation, she ran out the front door down the Oakline Drive, past the quarters where Suddy and Ruth and Patience would be waiting anxiously for news. She ran north toward the road that led away from Langford Plantation, clutching the satchel with her father's crimes documented inside, wearing the rough men's clothing Patience had given her, with Drummond's forged pass in her pocket and fear driving every step. Behind her, as she reached the main road and turned north, she heard the dogs begin to bark. Her father had discovered she was gone. The hunt had begun, but Margaret had a 30-minute head start. She had money and documents. She had a map and directions. And most importantly, she had something she had never had before. The knowledge that she was not alone, that there were people who would risk everything to help her survive. And that her father's power was not absolute. She ran through the freezing January night, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her mind clear and focused. She was going to live. She was going to expose him. And she was going to win. The journey north took Margaret 3 weeks, traveling mostly at night, hiding during the day in barns and root cellars and safe houses, guided by people whose names she never learned and faces she would never forget. The Underground Railroad moved her from Virginia through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, passing her from one set of hands to another like a precious and dangerous secret. She traveled as a young man, her hair cut short with the knife Patience had given her, her body lean and hard from months of labor, her voice kept deliberately low and rough. She was searched twice by slave patrols, and both times Drummond's forged pass saved her, though her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the paper. She reached Philadelphia on February 3, 1848. Half frozen and half starved, but alive. The first thing she did was find a lawyer, a Quaker abolitionist named Thomas Garrett, who specialized in cases involving fugitive slaves and disputed inheritances. She showed him everything. The documents from her father's safe, the journal detailing his plan to kill her, the letters he had written to the Prescott family lawyers lying about her situation, and the testimony she had written out during her journey about everything that had happened. Garrett read it all in silence, his face growing darker with each page. And when he finished, he looked at Margaret and said simply, "We are going to destroy him." The legal battle that followed lasted 8 months and became one of the most scandalous cases in Virginia history. The Prescott family lawyers, horrified by the evidence Margaret presented, immediately froze the trust funds and opened a criminal investigation into Colonel Langford's actions. The testimony from Celia, Ruth, Suddy, and even Hosea Drummond, all given under oath and at great personal risk, corroborated every detail of Margaret's story. The journal was the most damning evidence written in the colonel's own hand, describing his daughter as an expensive burden, and detailing his plan to resolve the situation permanently. Colonel Thaddeus Langford was arrested in March of 1848 and charged with attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The trial took place in Richmond in September, and it captivated the entire state. Here was a wealthy plantation owner, a war hero, a man of supposedly impeccable character, exposed as a monster who had tried to murder his own daughter for an inheritance. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence he would never complete. Colonel Thaddeus Langford died of pneumonia in the Richmond City Jail in February of 1850, alone and unmourned. His name forever synonymous with cruelty and greed. The trust money, all $32,000, was released to Margaret in November of 1848. She used part of it to purchase the freedom of Suddy, Ruth, Patience, and Celia, a transaction that required complex legal maneuvering, but which Thomas Garrett managed to accomplish. She also purchased the freedom of 15 other enslaved people from Langford Plantation, prioritizing families and those who had helped her during her time in the quarters. The plantation itself was sold to pay the colonel's debts and legal fees, and the remaining enslaved workers were scattered to other plantations, or in some cases sold south to the cotton fields of the Deep South, a fate that haunted Margaret for the rest of her life. Margaret never returned to Virginia. She settled in Philadelphia, where she became a quiet supporter of the abolitionist movement, using her money and her story to help others escape slavery. She never married, though she received several proposals from men who were drawn to her strength and her wealth. She would smile and decline politely, saying that she had learned to value her independence too much to surrender it. She lived with Suddy, Ruth, and Patience in a large house on Spruce Street, where they ran an informal safe house for fugitive slaves traveling through Philadelphia on their way to Canada. Margaret's story was documented by several abolitionists of the period, though they changed her name to protect her identity. She appears in the journals of William Lloyd Garrison as Miss M., a Virginia refugee who had experienced slavery firsthand despite being white and wealthy. Frederick Douglass mentioned her in passing in a speech in 1851, describing her as a woman who learned that oppression recognizes no boundaries of race when money and power are at stake. But Margaret herself rarely spoke publicly about her experience. The trauma of those months, the betrayal by her father, the violence she had witnessed and barely escaped, had left scars that never fully healed. Suddy lived until 1863, dying at the age of 86, free for the last 15 years of her life. She was buried in Eden Cemetery, one of the first cemeteries for Black Americans in Pennsylvania. And Margaret paid for a headstone that read, "Suddy, teacher and friend who showed others how to survive." Ruth and Patience both lived into their 70s, working as seamstresses and running their own small business, independent and thriving in a way that would have been impossible in Virginia. Celia married a freedman from New York and moved there in 1852, but she and Margaret continued to correspond until Margaret's death. Margaret Langford died on June 17, 1889 at the age of 65. She had outlived her father by nearly 40 years, had built a life of purpose and dignity, and had helped hundreds of enslaved people find freedom. But according to those who knew her in her final years, she never fully escaped the memory of that November night when her father had looked at her and called her worthless, never fully recovered from the knowledge that his love had always been conditional on her usefulness to him. She kept her mother's jewelry until the end. The pieces she had stolen from her father's safe. And when she died, she left instructions that they be sold and the money donated to schools for formerly enslaved children. The historical record of Margaret Langford is fragmentary and deliberately obscured. The court documents from her father's trial were sealed in 1851 at the request of the Prescott family, who wanted to avoid further scandal. They remained sealed until 1968 when a historian researching Virginia plantation families stumbled upon them by accident and was shocked by what they contained. Margaret's diary, the one discovered in 1923, has never been fully published, though excerpts have appeared in academic papers about women's experiences in antebellum, Virginia. And Langford Plantation itself was burned to the ground in 1865 during the final weeks of the Civil War, destroyed by Union troops who used it as a temporary headquarters and then torched it when they moved on, eliminating most of the physical evidence of the Langford family's crimes. But the story survives in fragments and whispers, in court records and abolition journals, in the memories of families whose ancestors were freed by Margaret's money or sheltered in her house. It survives as a reminder that the cruelty of slavery extended beyond race, that the corruption of absolute power infected every relationship it touched, and that even in the darkest moments, resistance was possible. Margaret Langford learned that survival required not just courage but community. That freedom was something you fought for and earned. And that the greatest act of rebellion was simply refusing to die when someone decided you were no longer useful. This mystery shows us that the greatest monsters are often those closest to us, wearing the mask of respectability while plotting unspeakable acts. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been other victims we'll never know about? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth may be buried, but it never truly disappears. See you in the next video.